guys, it's Becca, and I am finally here with my 5-part video series for my gray quilt sew-along. We're going to break this video series up into 5 videos. Video number 1 is going to be all the prep work and planning that needs to go into making this quilt. Video number 2 is going to be doing all of your cutting. Video number 3 is going to create your blocks. Video 4 will put your blocks together. And finally, video 5 is going to be getting this thing out the door into a long armor to quilt for you so that you don't have to do it. Now, disclaimer, if you like quilting and that's your favorite part, please feel free to just do number 5 on your own. That's my intro. Let's just dive right in. Okay, so as some of you know, the quilt that I am making is going to be for my husband for Christmas. And I got a little adventurous and decided I was going to make him a quilt for Christmas just 6 weeks before Christmas. Now, if you're a quilter, you know I'm a little out of my mind. I work full-time. I have other duties. Quilting is not something I get to do full-time. I'm lucky if I get to do it over a weekend, so I don't know what I was thinking. But I'm going to compensate for that by picking a pattern that is super simple. And because of that, it should be really easy to let you come along and do this sew along with me. If you've never sewn before, you've never quilted before, this might be a good video series for you to jump right in. What are we making? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're going to make a gingham style quilt, which is only going to use 3 different types of fabric. So this is video number 1. Let's talk about what you need, how you're going to pick your fabric, and how you're going to prep your fabric so that we can dive into lesson number 2, which is going to be doing our cutting. Okay, I'm going to flip the camera around and we're going to take a look. All you need for this gingham quilt is 3 different types of fabric, as I mentioned before. You need a dark, a mid, and a light. But there's a rule that you need to follow in order for this to really pop. You need to have some good contrast between your dark and your mid fabric. You want to probably stick with the same color value, just get different shades. So I went with gray. I got a dark gray and a light gray. They're in the same color family though. So I wouldn't want this to be a dark red and this to be a light blue because it's just not going to sit right. Part of the beauty of this quilt is making it look like this fabric is overlapping and giving you that dark square that's kind of tying it together. So these two need to blend, but there has to be contrast. The other tip that you need is this light print. Now you can use whatever you want, but if you really want that true gingham style, you want this to be a white-ish color. And so for this, I chose snow. It is not a pure white, but it is pretty close. You could get something that's like bone or natural or like a light ivory, as long as that white has good contrast from your mid and your dark prints. I'm using solids for this, and typically for me, I would not sew with solids, but I already know I'm going to send this out to a long armor, and I actually know who I'm going to send it to, so I'm super excited about that. I think that the solid colors are really going to let that quilting shine through. But you are welcome to use any sort of print. Just make sure that the colors for your mid and your dark match, but they're different shades, and you've got a white, a tone-on-tone, or a light print, something that reads as a white. All right, now let's talk about how to pick your fabric. So if you are brand new to quilting, you're probably like, okay, well, that's great. I understand a little bit about what you're talking about color-wise, but I have no idea where to go. That's easy. If you've got a quilt shop in the area, you want to go to your local quilt shop. They're going to have better quality fabrics. They're going to hold up better over time. You can also look for fabric on online shops like Fat Quarter Shop, Missouri Star. You can look at Etsy. Good quality cottons, you're going to want to look for those. You want 100% cotton. Try not to do anything with polyester. You can, of course, but I just find working with cotton gives me a better quality product in the end. If you go to Joann's, you'll want to make sure to look at fabrics that are in their quilting section and have 100% cotton listed on the edge of the bolt. If you want to work with solids, some great recommendations would be the Kona solids from their quilting cotton section. Let me show you one more tip if you've never shopped for fabric before, because when you're looking at a quilt store, you're going to probably see something like this. You're going to have all of the fabric just lined up on the shelf like this, And just reading it this way, you might not know if they work, especially when you have different fabrics in between here, or maybe this one's on one side of the store and this one's on the other. This is how I like to audition my fabric when I'm in the quilt store. So I pull off my bolt, and we'll just pretend that these are bolts of fabric. I like to lay my bolts on a table or a flat surface. Usually I'll go up to the cutting counter and do this. And I just kind of lay them one on top of the other so that I can kind of see the colors play with each other. And then I might shift it around a little bit. Like if I know that my quilt top is only going to ever have these two touching and never these two touching, or only these two touching, whatever. I'll lay them next to each other so they can see just a little bit of that print up next to each of these fabrics. And I'll do that until I am satisfied with how the palette looks. This one honestly wasn't that difficult because I was getting a dark gray, a light gray, and a white. But if you ever wanted to know how to audition your fabrics, this is what I do. All right, now let's talk about yardage. The pattern we're going to work from is a free quilt pattern by Fat Quarter Shop. It is called the 3-Hour Baby Gingham Quilt, and the finished product will measure about 40.5 by 50.5 inches, which honestly is a decent throw size for your front room. And once we get into this, you'll see that you can very easily add an extra row or two or an extra column or two just to make the size a little bit bigger. If you want your quilt to be 40 by 50, then get the exact amount of fabric that the pattern calls for. They want you to get 3/4 of a yard of your dark, 3/4 of a yard of your light, and 1 3/8 yard of your medium. But if you want it to be more like maybe 40 by 60 inches, round it up a little bit. You'll want 1 yard of your dark, 1 yard of your light, and 2 yards of your mid. Now, just disclosure, because you're going to see my quilt is much bigger than yours in the final product. I'm doing a queen size quilt, so I'm just blowing those numbers completely out of the water. Please do not do this if you are a beginner. I got 4 yards of my dark because some of this I'm going to use for a border and my binding. I got 4 yards of my mid and 2 yards of my white. So basically I've got 2 yards dark, 2 yards white, 4 yards of my mid, and then 2 extra yards of my dark so that I can do some fun borders and binding with it. Was that a whole lot of information? I hope I didn't overwhelm you. I know it was a lot to take in, and honestly, the scariest part of starting a quilt, for me anyways, is picking the pattern and picking the fabric. Once you have the pattern and you have the fabric, you're committed. You can just go. So this will be a great time for you to go to the quilt store and pick out the fabrics you're going to work with. But first, before you go, let me tell you what to do with that fabric once you get home. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how to prep your fabric, right? There's 2 methods for this, and both of them are right. It just depends on your own personal preference. You just have to understand what's going to happen to your quilt if you do one versus the other. When you buy your fabric and you come home, the first thing you're supposed to do if you're a traditionalist is to take all of this fabric, throw it in the wash, and then throw it in the dryer and grab it just before it's finally dry and press it, iron it nice and flat, fold it back up, and get it ready for your cutting. I don't do that. You don't have to do that if you want to cut. I don't. And let me tell you why I don't. Because number 1, I'm a lazy quilter. Number 2, I love working with pre-cuts. If you don't know what pre-cuts are, let me show you. They are things like this or like this. They range in anything from 2.5-inch squares all the way up to fat quarters and fat eighths. In my home, anything smaller than a half-yard cut does not get put in the washing machine because it is going to shrink up a little bit and I'm going to lose some fabric off the edges, the way they cut it. It's just a mess and a nightmare. So I don't pre-wash, and because I don't pre-wash my charm squares or my layer cakes or my mini charms or any of those other pre-cuts, I often put yardage with them And because of that, I'm not going to pre-wash my yardage either. This is it. This is what I work with. Now, I will use a bit of starch alternative or some steam when I'm ironing my fabric before I cut. And that does cause the fabric to shrink a little bit, but maybe not as much as it would if I would have pre-washed it. So you're probably asking yourself, if you're a beginner, if I don't pre-wash my quilt and everybody says you should, what are the implications of that? Well, honestly, your quilt top is going to shrink at some point. You can assemble it and then wash the quilt top, or you can assemble it, put it together, quilt it together, bind it, then wash it. As long as the fabric on the front and the back are the same type of fabric, meaning you have quilter's cotton on the top and quilter's cotton on the back, you should be okay. It's going to shrink up evenly and it's going to give you that crinkly, quilty texture. Just know that if your quilt pattern says that your quilt will be 40 by 60 inches when you're done, if you did not pre-wash your fabric, once you assemble the quilt top, quilt it up, and then toss it into the machine, it's not going to be 40 by 60 inches when it comes out. And I usually just mitigate that by adding an extra row, extra column, or an extra border so that I have something a little bit bigger of a quilt top to start off with. And then that way, after I've washed the quilt and gotten it back, it's still about the size I expected it to be. Or if you just don't care that much, deal with the shrinkage. No one's going to know. In fact, if you make a quilt for somebody and they take out a ruler to measure it, they're not your friend. And I would argue to say they're not quilt worthy. Don't make them another one. Okay, so that's all of the information that you need. You are well on your way to get started. Go forth and go shopping either from your stash, online, or your local craft store, quilt store, whatever works for you. Go find your fabric. You need your 3 colors. Bring them back here and be ready for lesson number 2. Hey guys, and while you're at it, if you could just give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you're joining me in this quilt series. Let me know what colorway you chose. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you're notified when video number 2 is posted. I'll see you guys all in lesson number 2. Bye!